Hello and welcome. Hi, I'm Dave. This tutorial is part of a Node.js and Express for Beginners tutorial series. I'll put a link to the full playlist in the description below. Today we will organize our Node.js and Express API server with the model view controller design pattern. You may have also heard this design pattern referred to as MVC. That said, remember, Express is by definition an unopinionated framework, and you can organize your project however you would like. I'm just demonstrating MVC because it's a popular pattern. We're going to start with the code repository from the last tutorial, but if you don't have it, you should be able to easily follow along without it, or you can download or clone the starter source code from the link I'm providing in the description below. Okay, we're right here in Visual Studio Code, and we've got our server.js file, and we want to use the correct terminology. So we were keeping our data inside of a data folder, and you can see I've renamed it to model. It still has the employees.json file in there, and we're just emulating a database here with a employees.json file instead of connecting to one at this point, because you might have MySQL or Mongo in mind or whatever. Later on in the series I plan to show Mongo. However, right now we're just going to simulate that connection to a database. And now besides that, we have a views folder. And really with a RESTful API, we won't have many views, if hardly one. Maybe we would have a welcome page that gives some directions about the API, but that's about it. We're not really serving a bunch of static pages or resources. What we will have though is a controller folder. So let's go ahead and create that. Oh, and I said controller, and really I should make this plural because it could host more than one. So let's go ahead and call this controllers, and it will hold controller files. So inside of here, let's go ahead and create an employees controller.js file. Now currently we have all of our logic really inside of our routes. So if we open up routes and the API directory and then look at employees.js, our logic is essentially the route handlers. So for router.route, and then we come to the get HTTP method, we've got this handler that returns all of the employees. So what we would want to do would be remove that logic from here and take it to the controller. So we could name this something like get all employees, and then we can just assign that route handler as a function. So now we have a get all employees function that is part of the controller. So let's save that. But what we also need here is the data. So the data that we were pulling in to the employees.js route inside the API is actually will need to be inside of the controller at this point instead of the route. We're breaking that out. And so we'll put that at the top of this file as well. So these functions can work with that data. So I'll save this again. And now back inside of employees, let's pull out the logic from the post. And here we go with that logic. And now we'll call this function a different name. We've got create new employee, and we'll set it equal to that action. And then the next function we'll go ahead and name as well, and that will be update employee. And we'll set it equal to what we find here in the put portion of this route. And now we'll come back and assign that to update employee. And finally, as you might guess, we'll have delete employee. And we'll set that equal to the handler for delete. Not copy, but cut. There we go. And we can paste that in here as well. Now I'll go ahead and save that. Now we're not finished with the controller by any means, but we have the first actions in here for these routes. And we haven't put anything back in here yet, but we will. But there's one more function to create here. And this would be called just get employee instead of get all employees. So let's go ahead and get this action as well, or route handler is what we could refer to those as still. And let's say get employee. And now we have all of these different functions defined inside of our employees controller. And of course, we're pulling in the data here at the top. But as you might expect, we need to export these as well. So we'll have module.exports. Let's set this equal to an object now. And so we had get all employees, and then we had create new employee, and we had update employee and delete employee, and then we had get employee. And so we're exporting all of these functions now. Let's go back to the employees.js routes and let's import our controller. So let's call this employees controller, and we'll set it equal to require, and then we have to consider where we are. So we go up a folder and then up another folder, and once we're there, now we can select the controllers folder, and inside there we find our employees controller. Now we could deconstruct those functions here as we import those in, but I think I'll leave the name employees controller because we're emphasizing creating a controller here, and then we'll just put in the functions. And in Visual Studio Code, I believe if I start typing the functions, it's going to import the part that says employees controller for me. And sure enough, it does. So now we can have create new employee and select that. And here we're going to have update employee. And finally, we should have delete employee. Not this delete, we didn't quite get that right. Delete employee, there it is. And so all of these actions are coming from the controller, or route handlers, we could say. And this still doesn't look right. We've got a D in front of there. Employees controller dot delete employee. That's what we should have. And now here we should have get employee with the employees controller. So this definitely cleaned up our route file here quite a bit, and we've separated the logic into our controller. And that's really what the model view controller pattern is all about. And so we could do that with other routes if we had other routes as well. But now we've really cleaned up our whole project. Let's go back and do just a little more cleanup in the server.js, and we can get rid of some of these views that we're no longer going to use. One other thing I'd like to do is, you see we're pulling some things into the server file right at the beginning, and we're starting to use the logger right away. But we're taking up a lot of space here with cores, and we don't have any kind of configuration folder over here in the file tree yet. So let's go ahead and create a config folder, now not JS, just config folder. And now we can go ahead and create a cores options.js file right there. And back in the server, let's go ahead and take our whitelist and cores options and cut those out of here and paste them into our cores options.js here. And I'm going to put each one of the URLs on its own line, just so it's easier to read. And after we define the whitelist at the top, we have our cores options. And as you might guess, we need to do module.exports, set this equal to cores options. And now we'll need to import this back inside of the server. So at the top of the server here, we could just put it right under cores, and we'll say const cores options and set this equal to require dot slash, there we go, config. And now inside of the config folder, we have our cores options. We can save that. Let's see if there's anything else we can clean up. I've got some extra comments in here. Of course, this being a tutorial, that kind of makes sense. Let's make them a little bit smaller. Just put form data besides that. And the routes look good. And we have our catch-all 404 here. And we have our error handler. And we have made our server.js much smaller. We're down to 44 lines of code, including some spaces here. And we have pulled that logic out into a controller. So that has really helped clean up, but we're really not going to need this example of a subdirectory anymore. So let's go ahead and get rid of that. And that means we can get rid of the app use for the static files in the subdirectory as well, and save that once again. And that means we can delete the subdirectory route from the tree. And we can also go ahead and delete the subdirectory over here in the views. And let's go ahead and delete the new page. And that means we can go into our root routes and we will not be routing to a new page or an old page any longer either, and get rid of both of those. And now that's quite a bit of cleanup, but at least we still have our splash page for the index if we wanted to put some directions for our API there. And so we're handling that inside of the root route, and that's in our routes folder. And then we have our API directory, and that handles the employees routes here. Okay, with everything cleaned up, in the last tutorial, I promised to go ahead and provide the JavaScript code. This is not so much just dealing with Express or Node, but the code, if you were to have an API that was going to update not the JSON file, but just in memory and kind of emulate an API before we've connected it to a database. So at this point, I can go ahead and provide that code. And if you went ahead and worked on the challenge that I said at the end of the last tutorial, you can compare your code to what I did. I'm just noticing I didn't change the path to the data folder here either for the employees, because really it didn't need to come up to anymore. So you would just come up out of the controller folder, and then you're not even going into a data folder at this point, you're going into a model folder. But I'm going to change this, all of this now, but I wanted to say that correction about the path. And let's have the data object set like this. And if you work with React, I'm thinking in more of a Reactful way when I do this, but I've got the employees data set, still pulling it in and just setting it directly to the employees property of the data object. But then I've got a set employees function here as well that I'll use inside of these other functions. Now, as you might expect, get all employees doesn't really need any extra work. We're just returning all of the employees by referencing data.employees, and that's fine. Now, to create a new employee, I'll paste in my code and we can review it. There's a little bit more work there. So when we get a new employee, we want to create the new ID, and instead of importing a package like UUID or something like that, I'm just grabbing the last employee in the JSON array, and I'm adding one to the ID that exists there, whatever the last one is. So of course I need to make sure they're in chronological order, which will come into play later. But that's what I'm doing here. Other than that, first name and last name assigned to the parameters we're getting from request.body, and then of course it's first name and last name. After that, we're making sure that a first name and last name are sent. And if not, we're sending a response 400 saying, hey, we didn't get the required data. After that, I'm using the set employees function to go ahead and set the employees to the new information. And of course, the new employee is at the end of the array. And I'm just realizing here I didn't send a different status when we send the employees back. And I'm sending all of the employees instead of just the new ones so we could see the update. But here we could also send a status of 201, which means it created the new record. And we'll go ahead and save that. Okay, update employee gets a little more complicated, but it's not too bad. So let's go ahead and paste this code in and review it. So here we grab the employee if we received an ID as a parameter, and we should because we're updating an existing employee. And if the employee does not exist, we're returning a response status 400, meaning we did not get good data to update. And we have the message here as well, employee ID is not found. And that would be the end of it if we didn't get an ID. But then if we did, then we're checking to see if we got a first name, go ahead and set the employee that we found to the new parameter value, and the same for last name, and of course to that parameter value as well. And then we filter the array and we remove the existing employee record from it. So then we have an array with the existing, or I mean without the existing employee ID, and then we have the new employee data that we've updated here. So we go ahead and create an unsorted array, and we need to remember it's unsorted because we do need this array in chronological order by ID. And so when I call the set employees function from our data object, I go ahead and sort the array by that ID column. And this is a chain ternary statement. This is where it could look a little complicated if you have not worked with sorting arrays before. So we start out with the ternary statement here saying pretty much if the one element of the array .id is greater than the other, then return 1. And normally, if we were just doing that, then if not, it would be returning a -1, but we need to have a 0 if they're even as well. So then we chain this into another ternary, and there it returns a -1 or the 0 at the end of that. And then of course we send the employees after they've been updated by set employees. And that puts the array, the JSON array, back in the order we need it right there. Okay, scrolling up to get a little room to put in the code for the delete employee. When we paste this in, it looks very similar. We find that employee, but if we didn't get the ID, we send the 400 response just like above. We also create a filtered array just like above we did in the update. But then at this point, we've deleted the employee, so all we need to do is set the employees to the filtered array. And then we once again return the employees. And finally, the get employee. And of course, this is handling a request for the data of just one employee. So we find out who that employee is. And once again, if the employee doesn't exist, we send that same response that we did not get good data. But if the employee exists, all we need to do is return that specific employee. And then we're down here to the exports. So I will include all of this code inside of the GitHub repository for the end. This will not be the starter code, but the beginning. And then you can see this and compare to yours if any of my explanation did not make sense. And it looks like I've got an error here in the code. I think I missed the ending curly brace. There it is. They should be yellow, at least the way I have my Visual Studio Code set up. Tab that over and save, and all looks good now. Now, I think I still have an issue here. The delete employee did not close out. If I close that out, then I can remove that. There we go. Almost had a bigger mistake that would have taken me longer to figure out. So save that, and now it looks like get employee, delete employee, update employee, create new employee, get all employees. That all looks like they're defined correctly, and there's no more error here in the file. Getting rid of the extra space, and let's go to Thunder Client, but we also need to go ahead and start the server up, because I don't think we have done that yet. And with the dev server open, the terminal open, we'll type npm run dev. There we go. And start the dev server, and then we'll be able to test out our API. Running on port 3500, that's what we needed. We'll open the employees API collection that I'd created in Thunder Client. And now this you'll have to create yourself, of course, if you haven't, but let's test get employees and see what we start with there. So we've got a get request, and we're going to the employees route to see the results. And we've got the two starter employees, Dave Gray and John Smith. Okay, now let's go to post, and let's post a new employee. And if we go to body, you can see I'm sending some raw JSON here. We're posting employee John Doe. We'll send that post request. There's a 201 created response like we wanted to send. And now we have John Doe here, and he has an ID of 3 as we expected him to. So now let's go to the put employee, and same route with a put request. We'll go to the body and see what I'm sending in the JSON. And let's change this. Let's update the second employee, so it's right in the middle, and change his name to David. Now let's go ahead and send. And now let's look at our employees that were sent back. And yes, second employee is now David Smith, and they're still in the correct order. He did not get inserted at the end. It's not out of order. And so that all worked as we wanted it to. Now let's try the delete employee. And let's look at the body once again, what's being sent in the request. And we're going to delete employee number 3. So let's go ahead and do that. And now if we look, all the employees were sent back. Now we only have 2 employees once again. And now let's finally request an employee. This is get an employee, and we're going to request employee number 1. Send that request, and it looks like we received the information back for employee number 1. So all of our routes are working as expected. Once again, I'll include everything that you saw today in the employee controller, if you're curious about the API code, I'll include that and more in the GitHub link that I'm going to put in. And don't mistake the final code or the starter source code. I will have a link to both. Give this video a like if it helped you get started with the Express framework for Node.js. And thank you for watching and subscribing. You're helping my channel grow. Have a great day, and let's write more code together very soon.